My Weirder-est School, Book Number 11. Mrs. Stoker is a Joker. Written by Dan Gutman. Pictures by Jim Palott. Chapter 8. This is not a drill. I don't know what happened to Mrs. Jaffe after that. She wasn't in school the next morning. I don't know if she's ever coming back. Other than that, it was a perfectly normal day at elementary school. And by that, I mean the weirdest thing in the history of the world happened. We were in Mr. Cooper's class. Well, that's not the weird part. We're in Mr. Cooper's class every day. We pledged the allegiance and did word of the day. Okay, everybody, said Mr. Cooper. Turn to page 23 in your math books. Ugh, not again. Why do we have to learn math if we have calculators? That's when the weird stuff started happening. An announcement came over the loudspeaker. It was Mrs. Stoker. Good morning, students and teachers, she said. Hey, did you hear they're going to start putting babies in the army? Yeah, they'll be in the infantry. Get it? Infantry? Babies? I didn't get it. But seriously, continued Mrs. Stoker, our security guard, Officer Spence, has an announcement to make. That was weird. Officer Spence hardly ever makes announcements. Starting right now, said Officer Spence. We are in a lockdown situation. You all know what to do. A lockdown drill? You know what that means. No math. Yay. Mr. Cooper slammed his math book closed. He looked really mad. Every time he tries to teach page 23 in our math books, there's some kind of interruption. We had a lockdown drill last week, Mr. Cooper said. Why do we have to do another one so soon? Do they have lockdown drills in your school? That's when you have to lock the whole school down. So it has the perfect name. At our school, we have a lockdown drill every few months. Mr. Klutz always said we had to be prepared for any kind of emergency situation. We knew what to do. Everybody got out of their seats and moved to the wall in the corner of the classroom, away from the doors and windows. I bet some aliens from another planet have landed, whispered Neil. It could be zombies, whispered Michael. It's probably alien zombies, I whispered. I'm scared, whispered Emily, who's scared of everything. Shh, said Mr. Cooper. Quiet, everyone. Speaking of drills, said Mrs. Stoker over the loudspeaker, the other day I drilled some holes in 2 pieces of metal and bolted them together. At first it was boring, but then it was riveting. Get it? Drills, boring, riveting? I didn't get it. Mrs. Stoker shouldn't be making jokes during a lockdown drill, whispered Andrea. It's not appropriate. For once in her life, little Miss Perfect was right. Lockdowns are serious stuff. We're supposed to stay completely quiet and wait until somebody announces all clear. Did you hear about the guy who got caught drilling a hole in the fence? Mrs. Stoker continued over the loudspeaker. The police are looking into it. Hey, do you know why hens are so good at fire drills? They know where to exit. Get it? Exit? Exit? Knock it off! Officer Spence suddenly shouted. No more jokes. I need all the students and the teachers to go to the all-purpose room immediately. This is not a drill. What's going on, Officer Spence? Asked Mrs. Stoker. We have an intruder, he shouted at her. Chapter 9. The Big Surprise Ending. What? An intruder? This was serious. We all rushed to line up in single file. Andrea was the line leader. Ryan was the door holder. Mr. Cooper looked worried as we hurried down the hall and walked 1,100,000 miles to the all-purpose room. Nobody was talking or making jokes. All the classes from kindergarten to 5th grade filed into the room. "What's going on?" I heard Mr. Cooper ask Officer Spence. "I was watching the security cameras," replied Officer Spence, "and I spotted a suspicious-looking person wearing a mask lurking around the playground." While we took our seats, Officer Spence went over and locked the doors of the all-purpose room. Then he locked the windows and closed the shades. Finally, he turned off the lights. It was completely dark in the all-purpose room. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. "Okay, everyone, stay low and stay quiet," said Officer Spence. "Stay away from windows and doors. Teachers, please silence your cell phones." "I'm scared," whimpered Emily. For once in her life, Emily had a good reason to be scared. We were all scared. "Everything is going to be all right," said Officer Spence. "Stay calm. I will protect you." We all got quiet. Mrs. Stoker looked like she might be tempted to crack a joke, but she stopped herself. After 1,100,000 minutes, I heard some footsteps in the hallway outside the all-purpose room. "Who's that?" somebody whispered. "Shh!" The footsteps were getting closer, and closer, and closer, and closer, and closer, and closer, and closer. "Okay, we get it." And closer, and closer, and closer, and closer. "Knock it off already." And closer, and closer, and closer. And then there was a knock at the door. "Don't answer it," somebody whispered. There was another knock at the door, a louder knock. "They're gonna break down the door," somebody whispered. "Speaking of doors," said Mrs. Stoker, "the other day a policeman knocked on my door and told me my dogs were chasing people on bikes. That's crazy. My dogs don't know how to ride bikes." "Shh!" shushed Officer Spence. "Mrs. Stoker should really stop cracking jokes," whispered Andrea. "This is a serious situation." "Let me in," somebody shouted from the other side of the door. Then there was banging on the door. "Open up," the person shouted from the other side of the door. Mrs. Stoker looked like she was going to crack another joke, but Officer Spence put one finger in front of his lips. "Shh," he whispered. "Don't make a sound." We were all on pins and needles. Well, not really. That would have hurt. We were just sitting there in the dark. But it was intense. Well, not exactly. We weren't intense. We were sitting on seats. It sounded like the person on the other side of the door was trying to pick the lock with a screwdriver or something. Officer Spence rushed over to the door. And then suddenly, the door swung open and somebody burst into the all-purpose room. The person was wearing a dark mask, so we couldn't tell who it was. "Freeze, dirtbag!" shouted Officer Spence. He pulled the mask off the intruder. And you'll never believe in 1,100,000 years who it was. I'm not gonna tell you. Okay, I'll tell you. It was Mr. Klutz. Gasp! Everybody gasped. "Betcha didn't see that coming." "All clear," shouted Officer Spence. "Relax, everybody, the lockdown is over." We all breathed a sigh of relief. Everybody started buzzing, but not like bees. "Is Dr. Carbles here?" asked Mr. Klutz, looking all over. "No," said Officer Spence. "Good," said Mr. Klutz. "He banned me from the school." "Then why are you here?" asked Officer Spence. I wanted to see what you would do in an emergency situation without me around, Mr. Klutz replied. Where's Mrs. Stoker? Mrs. Stoker was sort of hiding in the corner near the flag. Mr. Klutz marched over to her. He looked really serious. This isn't funny, he shouted at her. The principal of a school has a very important job. She is responsible for the safety of hundreds of children. There is a time for fooling around and a time to be serious. You need to act like a principal. Wow, that's Mom upside down. I'd never heard a grown-up get yelled at before. Mrs. Stoker looked really upset. Then the weirdest thing in the history of the world happened. She started crying. Everybody stopped buzzing and looked at her. It was so quiet you could hear the pin drop. Well, that is, if anybody brought pins to school with them. But why would anybody do that? Pins are sharp. You could poke out somebody's eye with one of those things. You're right, Mr. Klutz, Mrs. Stoker sobbed, hanging her head. I'm sorry. I tell way too many jokes. It's a big problem. I just can't seem to stop myself. She pulled a tissue out of her pocket and blew her nose into it. Well, she didn't actually blow her nose into the tissue, but you know what I mean. It's okay, Mr. Klutz said as he gave Mrs. Stoker a hug. Nobody is perfect. We all have our little quirks. I didn't know what a quirk was, but I made a mental note to get a little one after I got home from school. Everybody gave Mrs. Stoker a round of applause. I'm sure you're going to be a great principal, Mr. Klutz told her. I'll try to be better in the future, she replied. And speaking of the future, do you know why the astronauts of the future will be cooking hamburgers on asteroids? Oh no. I give up, said Mr. Klutz. Why will the astronauts of the future be cooking hamburgers on asteroids? To make them a little meatier, Mrs. Stoker replied. Get it? Meteor? Meteor? Ha ha ha. Too soon? It's okay. I got 1,000,000 of them. Kids, are you with me? I know you're out there. I can hear you breathing. That's pretty much what happened at school. I got to see it with my own eyes. Well, it would be pretty hard to see something with somebody else's eyes. Maybe Mrs. Stoker will stop cracking bad jokes all the time. Maybe Mr. Klutz will take a helicopter to do his grocery shopping. Maybe Mr. Cooper will buy a new box of straws. Maybe Mrs. Jaffe will count the spoons in the lunchroom. Maybe Dr. Kerbals will go jump in the lake. Maybe Andrea's clog dancing lesson will be cancelled. Maybe they'll put babies in the army. Maybe we'll get the glue out of our pants. Maybe alien zombies will attack the school. Maybe the astronauts of the future will cook hamburgers on asteroids. But it won't be easy.